I'm Howard Friedman. I'm the director of the Jewish Community Library in San Francisco, and I'm very glad to welcome all of you and especially appreciate your joining us on this beautiful day in the Bay Area. I want to thank our co-presenter, New Lehrhaus, and as always, I want to thank the Friends of the Jewish Community Library who make everything we do possible, especially now that the library is independent. I hope you'll consider becoming a friend by giving at any level at friendsofthejcl.org. And today's program is made possible in part by Emily Brewer in honor and memory of her father, Dr. Richard Brewer. May his memory be a blessing. Please note that automated closed captioning can be turned on or off by clicking the CC button at the bottom of your screen. And we'll all be muted except for our presenter, but people will have the opportunity to ask questions after the presentation. So please put your questions in the chat, and then I'll relay them at the end, time permitting. It is a great pleasure having Azzan Yadin-Israel with us. He earned his BA from the Hebrew University and his PhD from UC Berkeley and the Graduate Theological Union. And he is now a professor of Jewish Studies and Classics at Rutgers University. His books are wide-ranging. They include books on rabbinic midrash, on the theological concepts found in Bruce Springsteen's lyrics, and on language. And today he'll be speaking about his most recent book, Temptation Transformed, the story of how the forbidden fruit became an apple, which was published last year by the University of Chicago Press. It's a fascinating topic, and we look forward to learning from you, Azzan. I now hand it over to you.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Howard, and thank you for the invitation. Thank you to the new Lehrhaus, whose key players are here with us and were instrumental in this invitation. So thank you to David and Rachel Beal. So let me just present a little overview of what I'm going to share with you today. And then we're going to get to the kind of presentation itself in terms of the texts and the images that I want to share with you. So the project that I am going to be presenting to you, which has occupied me for the several years leading up to the publication of the book, is really an attempt to try and figure out something that most people don't think needs to be figured out. By that, I mean that the identification of the forbidden fruit with the apple, the idea that the apple is the forbidden fruit, is so widespread that it's simply like a cultural given. And we see this in scholarly work, but we also see it in New Yorker cartoons and in all kinds of, images that you have about the fruit being, the apple being a particularly tempting fruit, or the somehow forbidden or somehow tied to sin. All of those things are for everyone just a cultural given. And in that respect, when things become so familiar that we don't even need to wonder about them, it is interesting to think about how that came to be, why we think that that is the case, why we identify the forbidden fruit with the apple, and so on and so forth. So what I'm going to be presenting, it basically consists of a number of, let me just share this with you. So here is, one moment. Let's start from the beginning here. There we go. So hopefully this is, Howard, can you just give me a thumbs up if this is okay? Great. So what you can see here is the cover of my book on the forbidden fruit. And what I'm going to be presenting is made up of 4 sections. The first is a brief reference to the fact that the apple does not appear in the ancient sources. The second is the currently accepted interpretation of why the apple became the forbidden fruit. The third section consists of a survey of the art of the forbidden fruit, or the art of what comes to be known as the fall of man. And finally, section 4 is my explanation of this particular historical development. So as Howard said, if there are questions, I cannot see, when I'm sharing screen, I cannot see the comments. So I'll just say, Howard, if there's anything urgent, you just unmute yourself and, let me know. All right. So, all right, without further ado, the first part has to do with the absence of the forbidden fruit. The absence of the apple in discussions of the forbidden fruit. And here, I'm just going to look at a few biblical sources and early translations and commentaries. So obviously, we need to go to the original source, which is the book of Genesis. And what we see, to no one's surprise, is that the Hebrew original speaks of a fruit, but it doesn't mention the nature of that fruit. Vatikach mipirio, she took of its pri, the Hebrew word for the generic word for fruit, and that's reflected in the translations of the Hebrew Bible as well. The same thing is true for the earliest biblical translation, which is the Greek translation, known as the Septuagint. There, the Greek word is karpos, kailabusatu karpu autu ephagen, and she took of its fruit and ate. Again, a generic term, nothing specific. The ancient Latin translations, there are different recensions. It's not that important because for our purposes, the key point is that all of them use the word fruit, including the one that appears on the bottom of the screen, which is the Vulgate, the translation into Latin done by Jerome, which became the de facto Bible of the Christian Middle Ages. In other words, once Latin became the scholarly language of Europe, the Vulgate was the Bible as far as most scholars or most Christian scholars were concerned, and that's going to be an important point a little later. If we look at early interpreters, we find an interesting development. There is a very lively scholarly discussion concerning the identity of the forbidden fruit. And what we see is that there are various candidates who are put forth in that role, but the fruit is not one of them. So what we're looking at here is an edited section from Bereshit Rabbah, a early rabbinic commentary on the book of Genesis. And the question here is, what was the forbidden fruit? That's just outright the question that this deals with. And Bereshit Rabbah collects a number of possible answers from different rabbis. Rabbi Meir identifies the forbidden fruit as wheat, which is an interesting identification, and I can say more about that later if anyone's interested. Rabbi Yehuda Bar Ilai says grapes. Rabbi Abba of Akko says the citron, the etrog. Rabbi Yosef says figs. And then finally, the last position is that God did not reveal the nature of the tree to anyone, nor will we ever know what it is, nor will God reveal it in the future. So the first point, just to reiterate, is that even when we have various fruit proposed as the forbidden fruit, the apple is not one of them. A second point of interest is that this list does contain the two fruit that are going to become the most prominent forbidden fruits, as it were, in Europe. And those are the grapes and the figs. The fig is the easiest to explain. After Adam and Eve consume the forbidden fruit, they immediately realize that they're naked and they cover themselves with fig leaves. That doesn't mean that the forbidden fruit was a fig, but at least, if you're an interpreter who's reading through the narrative in the book of Genesis, you have a connection there. They were standing by a fig tree, so maybe it was a fig. At least that's some kind of plausible deduction. The grapes are not as clear in terms of the Genesis narrative, but they become associated with sin because of the association of alcohol with sin. Their association of alcohol with sin, and also prohibitions against drinking that the Torah has for the priesthood. So between those elements, the grapes also become a very popular forbidden fruit. All right, that's on the Jewish side. If we look among early Christian commentators, we find a similar situation. There are Christian commentators who talk about figs, and some, like the one we have here, who refer to the grapes. This is a commentary in the book of Genesis by a very important early Christian scholar named Origen, and he's commenting on the book of Genesis after Noah and his family exit the ark. One of the first things that Noah does is plant a vineyard. And the passage here states, here's the verse, Noah was the first to plant a vineyard, and Origen says, such was the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil. All right, so the vineyard, the grape, was the fruit of good and evil. All right, so all I've tried to do in this brief introduction is to show that neither the biblical sources themselves, in other words, the Bible or the early translations, nor later commentaries identify the forbidden fruit as an apple, even when they are speculating on the identity of the fruit. Okay, so that's part one, the absence of the apple. So now we can turn to the second part, which I call the bad apple, and you'll see why in a moment. Obviously, scholars have recognized that the forbidden fruit was not identified in the biblical text. And of course, from a certain point, they knew that it was identified with the apple and wanted to explain why that happened. And the reason that was given, let me just jump forward for a little bit. Okay. The reason that was given is that there is a play on words in Latin that generated this identification. So what are we referring to? The Latin word for apple is malum, and the apple word for evil or an evil thing is also malum. So basically, you have a Latin homonym, malum, malum, and one of the meanings of malum is apple, and one of the meanings is evil. Those aren't the same word with different meanings. They're simply words that are spelled the same way and have different meanings. So there you go. The argument is, well, we know that the forbidden fruit brought about the fall of man, the expulsion from the Garden of Eden, the introduction of death into the world, all of these terrible things. This is the source of a terrible theological malum, a bad thing, an evil. What would be more natural than that the fruit in question would be a malum, an apple, right? Okay, that's the argument. It's a great argument. I love it. It's a nice midrash, you know, malum in Latin. So the presumption is that somewhere along the way, when Christian scholars were writing in Latin, someone came across this and said, you know, it must have been this. They probably didn't say, because that's a little too Yiddish. But anyway, you get the idea, whatever medieval Latin writing Christian scholars said, but, you know, the equivalent. And that hypothesis or that explanation is completely dominant today. I mean, not only have I found it in dozens and hundreds of scholarly sources, it is also found in kind of popular explanations. I found it goes back at least to the 1570s. In other words, I found a text from the 1570s where the author says, as is well known, this is how some people explain the appearance of the apple. So it's hundreds of years and very widely explained and very widely accepted. There's just one small problem with the bad apple theory, and I don't mean to nitpick, but it has absolutely no basis in any historical evidence. You know, call me a nitpicker, but it really has no basis. Well, how so? Well, first of all, if we look at the terminology that Latin authors use when they talk about the forbidden fruit, we find a few different options. One is fructus, the word for fruit, which we saw in the Vulgate earlier. And that's very straightforward. Once it's in the Vulgate, it's used, it's attested very widely. There's another word that appears in some authors, which is the word kibus, and kibus is a Latin term meaning food. Not very widely attested. By far the most widely attested is the word pomum. Pomum is a Latin word meaning tree fruit. It appears in dozens and dozens of sources, probably hundreds of sources, including Augustine, including Thomas Aquinas, including a whole series of very prominent Christian authors. And it's so widespread that you actually have a series of phrases, the phrases here at the bottom, that all mean forbidden fruit. Pomum interdictum, pomum prohibitum, pomum vetitum. Those are all Latin phrases meaning the forbidden fruit, the forbidden pomum. What is absent here is the word malum, right? We do not find medieval Christian authors writing in Latin, which is where we would expect this Latin play on words to appear. We do not find these authors using the word malum. In fact, even in passages where the word malum in the sense evil appears, because after all, the tree of knowledge is the tree of knowledge of good and evil. So when Latin interpreters are writing about this, they can use the word evil, malum. Even when they use that word, they still refer to the forbidden fruit as a pomum and not a malum apple. Okay, I'll just give you one example, which looks like it was written for my talk. It's by Alan of Lille, who's a French author, a French theologian and Bible scholar and commentator who lives in France. Obviously, you see Lille, but is writing in Latin, which was standard in the 12th century. And he says, only by the prohibition of God was it bad to eat the fruit. Was it bad, malum, to eat the fruit, pomum, after the prohibition of the Lord? Indeed, to eat the fruit, pomum, was generally good, but through the prohibition of God, it became bad, malum. So the theological point here is that the forbidden fruit was not inherently bad. There was nothing evil about the fruit itself. It was simply a transgression once God prohibited it. We're not that concerned with Alan of Lille's theology. What I am focusing here on is the fact that he uses the word malum, evil, but does not make the connection between that and the Latin word malum, apple, and he keeps referring to it as pomum. So even where you kind of have the possibility of making this play on words, no one does. Okay? So much so that among the greatest Christian Bible scholar of the 12th century, Andrew of St. Victor, we find the following commentary on Genesis 3:7. The verse is, they sowed fig leaves. In other words, after Adam and Eve consumed the forbidden fruit, they realized they were naked and sewed fig leaves into aprons or coverings, garments of some sort. And Andrew of St. Victor says, some say that the forbidden tree was a fig because of this verse, and others that it was a vine, in other words, a grape. And he gives another verse for that, which we don't have to go into. This is an important passage for us because Andrew of St. Victor, who is also a French scholar, the St. Victor monastery is a little bit north of Paris. He's not even taking a position himself. He's not even arguing that it's this or that. He's just surveying what the different views are about the identity of the forbidden fruit. And the two that he surveys are the fig and the vine, the fig and the grape. He doesn't even know of anyone arguing that it's an apple. This is all very problematic because we thought we knew that this was a standard identification, the forbidden fruit and the apple. And the only question was, does that identification come about because of this Latin play on words, as many people think, or as many scholars claim? Now, having looked at the Latin sources, or if I could say this in a biographical sense, having spent a year reading all the Latin commentators that are out there, we're actually in a worse place than we started, because not only do these sources not confirm this Latin play on word explanation, it's not even clear where the apple is. You know, these sources don't even seem to know that anyone believes that the forbidden fruit was an apple, right? So we're kind of at a dead end in that sense. So thank you so much for your time. No, that's not the end. That's not the end. We're not going to stop at the dead end. What we are going to do is have to come at the question from a new direction. And what but a new direction, that means the iconography of the forbidden fruit. In other words, the artistic depiction of the forbidden fruit. Okay, so once the Latin sources led to this dead end, my question was, well, where and when does the forbidden fruit become an apple? Where is this first represented? And the texts don't tell us. Maybe the art will. Okay, so let's take a look at this. And let me preface this a little by saying that when I started this project and realized I would have to work on the art history, I assumed that that would entail my reading the 2 or 5 or 20 books on the representation of the forbidden fruit in Western art. And, you know, I'd have to summarize and distill. It turns out that the number of books that have been written on the artistic representation of the forbidden fruit is 0. This topic has never been explored in by art historians, certainly not in any sustained way. You know, there are articles here and there about particular images, but never in a sustained way. So I had to collect all these images, or all this artistic material, and I've placed it on the website that you can see here, treeofknowledgeart.com. If you want to see the images that are at the basis of this discussion, I collected over 500 images. Not all of them are on the website because I didn't always get permission from the owners, from the copyright holders, but many of them are, and you're welcome to examine that if you so desire. All right. So let's dive into the history of the representation of the forbidden fruit. Early Christian and Carolingian art. So the earliest images, or among the earliest images, are early Christian artists in Rome. And here we have some murals. These are fresci or frescoes from the catacombs under Rome, late 3rd and early 4th centuries. You can see here that the iconography is very similar. Adam and Eve on either side of the tree. The serpent usually in the middle. It's not always clear what the tree is, what kind of tree it is. But in many cases, such as if you can see here, these wide leaves are fig leaves very clearly. And the fig actually is the most commonly represented forbidden fruit in early Christian art. Here again, it's a little hard to see because the resolution isn't as good, but these are visibly fig leaves if you expand it in high resolution. Here we have the beautiful Junius Bassus sarcophagus with so a sarcophagus is basically a burial box of sorts, but made of marble with very elaborate, at least for the wealthy deceased, with very elaborate scenes, often with biblical scenes, because this is the moment where the deceased is hopefully going off to heaven, and they want these kind of biblical images there. Adam and Eve. This is a wonderful, wonderful image, aside from my interest in the identity of the forbidden fruit, because it represents the two of them just kind of looking away in shame in some way, or just the sin has brought about a break between the man and the woman in a certain sense. For our purposes, one second, for our purposes, you can see the next, I've zoomed in a little. Up here, you can see that these are fig leaves. Okay, so again, a very common image of the figs. Not every single image is figs. Here's a sarcophagus from France, from Toulouse, which was either made locally or perhaps imported from Rome. There's a debate about its origins. But in any case, you see that it's not a fig tree and a fig, but it's not clear what it is. So because of the nature of this particular inquiry, that's also very interesting for us, because it just says that it's not an apple. Later in Carolingian art, under Charles the Great, you get this very dramatic rise in illuminated manuscripts and Bibles that are wonderfully decorated. And you can see here, this is an image of two people, not three. It's kind of like a comic book in terms of like going from frame to frame. So on the left of the screen is Eve picking the forbidden fruit. On the right, she's giving it to Adam, and they're both eating. Again, for our purposes, you can see that the broad fig leaves and the figs that are on the tree. And even when it's not, in another Carolingian art, in another piece of Carolingian illumination, it's still not an apple. So this is not a fig, but it's also not an apple. It's not clear what it is. And it's further not clear that the artist was trying to depict a botanically accurate tree. Some kind of tiny little red fruit are on there. By the way, just interesting point, on the right is God. So, that's God standing with Adam and Eve, or it may be Jesus in this case. It's unbeard. If with no beard, it may be Jesus. But very common depictions in medieval works where you just see God and Jesus as basically peers of the biblical figures. All right. We're going to move a little bit further historically and also start focusing on different geographic regions. So now if we look at France, early on, we find a great deal of continuity with fig leaves. This is a very interesting example. This is one image from the Basilica of Saint Madeleine in Vézelay, France. And you can see that the forbidden fruit is a cluster of grapes, right? You can see the clusters there. In the same church, another image of the temptation, and this time with pomegranates, right? I hope the resolution is good enough that you can see the little crowns of the coronas of the pomegranate. That's very striking because it means that there was no theological push for unity. They weren't trying to get everyone to depict the forbidden fruit in the same way, it's the same species, so that in a single church you could have two images, one with grapes and the other with pomegranates, and no one seemed perturbed by that. Some of the images are not clearly a botanical fruit, but as we knew would happen at some point, we do find in the 12th century, as far as I can tell for the first time here, an image of Adam and Eve with an apple. In higher resolution, it's a little bit clearer, but you know, you can the apple has a very clear shape. That kind of indentation at the bottom of the apple is very clearly evident. And once it appears, the apple very quickly becomes the dominant forbidden fruit across different media and across different parts of France. So this is in Vienne, in southern France. This is in Paris. We get more and more and more images of the forbidden fruit. Here's a beautiful image of the forbidden fruit having been bitten, right? You see the white, the inside, the flesh of the apple, because Eve, who is on the right, has taken a bite and is now passing it to Adam. And just, I'm going to scroll through this a little bit, you know, basically just becomes apple, apple, apple. Okay. Now, you know, let me go back one little bit. Becomes apple, apple, apple. And this is a very curious thing because it's not clear why the apple suddenly has become one of the candidates in France. And it's also not clear why, having become a candidate, it dominates the iconographic scenery in the way it does. There's no real explanation for that. I mean, I think there is, but as things stand right now, from what we've seen up until now, there's no real justification for that because we've seen that various fruit can be the forbidden fruit side by side. And yet when the apple appears, it kind of pushes everything. It marginalizes all the other fruit, even though they've been around for hundreds and hundreds of years, close to 1,000 years at this point. If we're turning to Germany and the lowlands, very similar dynamic. It's an early fig representation on Ottonian bronze doors. A red fruit may be an apple, not clear, but certainly not the dominant figure because you can see here, early 13th century, pomegranates, these kind of stylized pomegranates. And this is God. This is God pointing out what tree to avoid, what the prohibited tree. And Adam is acknowledging that by making the same manual indication. But the same thing happens a little bit later than in France. The apple appears and it quickly becomes the dominant image. And here we are in what's sometimes referred to as the Northern Renaissance. famous image by Hieronymus Bosch. The serpent is giving Eve an apple. Hugo van der Goes, Adam and Eve with apples. Two very famous images from Dürer. This carving, this engraving that has Adam and Eve with apples, and also a diptych. This is only one side. This is the Eve side, with Eve holding a tempting red apple. So basically, we have a very similar dynamic, right? We just, like what we saw in France, repeats itself a little bit later in Germany and the Netherlands. I didn't bring the images to this presentation, but the same thing happens in England. So we have France followed by Germany, the Netherlands, England, and we would expect to see the same in Italy. Why wouldn't we? Early on, figs, more figs, more figs, unidentified. 13th century is still figs. These are, you can see the very distinct fig leaves on the tree that and now we're in the 14th century and we're still seeing fig leaves and figs, right? And basically this goes on and on and on. Fig leaves in the Vatican, in Raphael's imagery from the 16th century. And even the most famous of all, the Sistine Chapel Fall of Man, still fig leaves. Still fig leaves, and in higher resolution images, you can see the fig that the serpent is handing to Eve. We are now about 350 to maybe 400 years since the apple appeared in France. But in Italy, nothing has happened. The process that took place in Germany, in the Netherlands, in England, where the apple appears, becomes very popular, very dominant, has not occurred here. Has not occurred in Italy. And again, I have not brought all these images because just, for considerations of time, the same thing is true of Spain. Spain does not become an apple country until much, much later. In Italy, eventually, we do find in the very, in the middle of the 16th century, we start finding apples. Here's a very famous picture by Titian. So ultimately, it does transition to the apple, but hundreds and hundreds of years later than France, after having been a fig country for much longer than anyone else. Okay, so what do we have here? Well, we don't have any answer, but we do have clearer questions. In other words, we now, instead of just saying, well, why did the forbidden fruit become an apple? We have a set of historic specifications that we need to integrate into our analysis. Why did the forbidden fruit become an apple in 12th century France? Once the apple appeared, why did it marginalize all the other candidates, including the fig, including the grape, that had been the dominant forbidden fruit for hundreds and hundreds of years? And finally, why this odd dissemination of the apple? In other words, why does it spread so quickly and so effectively into Germany, into the Netherlands, and into England, but it doesn't really make much headway in Italy or in Spain? Right. So any answer that we're going to give ideally will respond to those three questions. Why France? Why does it displace the other candidates? And why is it propagated in this curious pattern? All right. As it happens, I think I have the explanation for all of this. And it does not have to do with the Bible. It does not have to do with theology. It doesn't have to do with any of the regions where scholars have traditionally looked for these answers. It has to do with a shift in early European vernaculars. In other words, in the spoken languages of early Europe. In Old French, we're shifting now to Old French. We're going to talk about Old French, about Middle High German and Middle English, but we're starting with Old French because that's the most important. In Old French is a derivative or a descendant of Latin. We saw that that the word pomum means tree fruit in Latin. So it is not surprising that we find that the word pomme also means fruit, a generic term for fruit in Old French. So here we have an early translation of Genesis 1:11. This is the verse where God says, as you see at the bottom of the image, let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees of every kind. The fruit trees here are generic. It's just trees bearing fruit. It's the creation of the world. It's the first day of creation. And the Old French translator, where I've underlined the words, arbre portant pomme, trees bearing pomme, trees bearing fruit. There are other, I think I have a couple more here. Yeah, there are a few more examples here of Old French texts that refer to the word pomme as fruit, or that employ the word pomme as fruit. I'm not going to go over all of them. This is just, this is well documented. But sorry, one more. You see here, this is a variant, pomme and pomme. So you have here like pomme de pin, the fruit of the pine cone, of the fruit of the pine tree, meaning the pine cone, or the pomme of the cypress, or pomme de terre, fruit of the earth, referring to, a bunch of growths that are grow in the earth. Clearly, this doesn't mean an apple. Clearly, this is a generic term for fruit, and that is completely congruent with the meaning in Latin. However, the word for apple, malum, does not pass into Old French. In other words, the word malum, evil, does, and we know that from, mal as a word in French. It also passes into English through French. Words like maleficent and malfeasance and all of those words are all from mal, evil. But the word malum, apple, does not enter into French, probably because of its association with evil. In other words, people don't want to, go to the market and say, give me, a pound of evil. It's like it's not a good term. It's not something you want to be bringing into your home. So for a period, there is no word for apple in Old French. There's just this like lacuna, this gap, where the word malum from Latin has not entered, and there's nothing specifically referring to apples in the language. And that is why we begin to see a process that's called semantic narrowing. The meaning of the word pomme, which we just saw was fruit, the meaning begins to narrow and refer specifically to apples. Okay? Let me just give you one example. I think that this is just the only slide I have of this. The second example here speaks of pomme, père, kiri, et autres fruits, qu'il est dit fruitière pour vera. In other words, sorry, I didn't bring a translation here. I'm just translating it for you right now. So pomes and pears and cherries and other fruit that the said fruit vendor will provide. Obviously, when you have this kind of list, the old French word pomme alongside pears, cherries, and other fruit, clearly it's referring to a specific fruit. It's not a generic term for fruit anymore. It's a specific fruit, one in this list, one in this enumeration. It's the word for apple, and that occurs in other places as well. Mala in the gloss above, the Latin word for the plural form of apples, is glossed in other words, in the side of the text, someone has written in an Old French translation using the word pomme, that the apples are now referred to as pomme. So apple becomes the specific meaning of pomme, even though it had earlier meant generically fruit. Okay, great. Why does that matter? It matters because in the old translations old French translations, the word pomme was also used to denote the forbidden fruit. That should not surprise us. We saw that the Latin word pomum was the most common term used to designate the forbidden fruit. Most of these authors are translating from the Latin. So when they come across the word pomum in some context, they render it with pomme, with the French word pomme, which is, obviously its descendant and its equivalent. This is Evrat's Old French translation. This is the earliest translation of the book of Genesis into French, where he writes, "For she ate of the pomme." She ate of the fruit, the pomme. The same thing occurs in other ancient sources. Again, I don't have the translations here, but it says, I'm just translating, for the due to the eating of the pomme, the flavor of the pomme, that had been prohibited. Okay, and here again, pomme is a generic term for fruit. Even in broader non-biblical contexts, these are the stories of Renard the fox. This is like a folkloric character, this cunning fox who exposes the hypocrisy of people and things like that. At one point, there's a reference to, because of the pride and the cunning, it was that Adam ate of the pomme, of the fruit. Oh, so this idea that the forbidden fruit is the pomme is very prevalent in Old French literature. So what? What does that matter? Oh, I think I have one more example, right? Even among people who don't read, which was the vast majority of medieval Christianity, the poem still finds its way in through theater. So the Jeu d'Adam, the Adam play, is the oldest European play. And it tells the story of Adam and Eve and the fall of man. And basically, there was a theatrical troupe that went from village to village and performed the play of the transgression and the punishment as part of the kind of Christian education of people who didn't know how to read. And there too, this is the Anglo-Norman version, per un pomme, because of a pomme, I lost your love. I lost God's love. What does all this matter to us? Why is this important to us that the word pomme used to mean fruit and then becomes apple? In these passages that I'm showing you, where pomme is used to refer to the forbidden fruit, The original intent of the authors was undoubtedly to refer to a fruit. They know the Bible, they know Jerome's translation, they know that it's just a fruit. And they're using pom in the earlier sense of a fruit. But once that semantic change occurs, once that semantic narrowing occurs, and the word pom in the ears of Old French speakers no longer means fruit, but rather apple, the entire engagement with the book of Genesis and all these other passages about the fall of man, and even, the stories of Renald the fox and the play that you see at the town square, all of those sources are now communicating a very simple message. Eve gave Adam an apple. Eve was tempted by the apple brought about the downfall, the apple brought about the original sin. All of these things are now understood to refer to an apple, even though that was not the original intention of the translators or of the authors. And what I can show, I can't do this here for reasons of time, I can show the moment where pom actually comes to mean apple, and that meaning dominates at least in Paris. And that is precisely when we begin to see the forbidden fruit represented as an apple in the iconography. All right. So what I want to suggest is that I've now answered two questions. Why did the forbidden fruit appear in France when it did? It appeared there because that's when this linguistic shift occurred. And the second question is, why did the forbidden fruit become so dominant? Well, the answer is obvious. If the book of Genesis is telling you that Eve gave Adam a pom, and pom means apple, what are you going to start? What are you doing with a fig? What are you doing with a grape? What are you doing with a pomegranate? The book of Genesis is telling you. End of story, right? So those two questions are explained, I think, by this linguistic shift, by the narrowing of the word pom from fruit generically to apple. We still have a third question, which is what happens with the dissemination. And what we find here is something very interesting, which is that the same semantic narrowing occurs in German and in English. I'm not going to go into this in detail now, but the Middle High German word Äpfel originally meant fruit. Again, we can see in Genesis 1:11, God said, let the earth put forth vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees. And you can see here, Apfelbaum. The baum is the tree, and Apfel, the trees of the apple, as it were. Apfel, right? And there are other examples here too, but for reasons of time, I'm just going to move forward and say that the same shift happens. And here are examples of where it means apple. So the same narrowing, which is influenced by the French. French becomes the dominant language of the German courts and of the German intellectuals. So the shift from pom fruit to pom apple is reflected in the native German term Äpfel, which goes from being a term for fruit to apple. And the same thing happens in English. And I assume most of us are native English speakers, and yet we can learn something. I certainly did not know this when I started this project. Here is the Wycliffe translation, the first full translation into Middle English. Again, our friend Genesis 1:11, God says, let the earth bring forth fruit trees. And you can see underlined that Wycliffe renders this, God said, let the earth bring forth apple tree, making fruit by his kind, right? Making fruit by its kind. So apple here is a generic term for fruit. But as we all know, as English speakers, that is not what it comes to mean. It comes to be a specific term for apple, the way we understand it, that specific fruit. In all those places, in other words, in German in English. The same thing happens in Dutch. I'm not going to belabor this. The semantic shift, the narrowing of the meaning of the word from a general meaning for fruit to a narrow one for apple corresponds with the iconographic shift. In other words, you can see the language change, and at the same time, the art is changing. The meaning shifts in the language, and the artists begin representing the forbidden fruit as an apple. So that means that the artists who are making this art are learning about the stories of the Bible in their vernacular languages, in Old French or in Middle High German or in Middle English. And then they're bringing that understanding to their art. They're bringing that understanding to how they represent the forbidden fruit. Where do those semantic changes, those linguistic changes not happen? They don't happen in Italian, because the Italian word for apple is mela, and that's always been the word. It didn't mean fruit originally. And they don't happen in Spain, because the Spanish word manzana also has been around for, basically it's a Latin term and has meant the apple since the beginning. So where we have this linguistic shift, the art follows, and you can see that the apple becomes the forbidden fruit. Where you don't have this linguistic shift, in Italy, the fig remains dominant for hundreds of years. The final moment is the invention of the printing press. The invention of the printing press creates a number of centers in Europe of printing, and they are all northern apple countries. So here you have the biggest bestseller is Martin Luther's Bible translation, the translation into German. And Luther wanted to make it accessible, so he encouraged the use of woodcuts and illustrations in his Bible. And this is the first illustration that includes the fall of man. And as you can see, Eve is reaching for an apple. So it is at this moment that the apple, because of the dominance of northern cities in the printing industry, the apple is just disseminated throughout and becomes the forbidden fruit, the way it is to this day, even in young adult literature and so forth. So that's basically how the forbidden fruit becomes the apple as we know it. And most importantly, thank you. All right, I'm going to stop sharing here. I don't mean that in a developmental way.
So thank you so much. Oh, this was really amazing to accompany you in this detective work and see that it incorporated your background both as a religious scholar and as a linguist.
Yeah.
So we do have a few questions, and I do invite folks to put their questions in the chat. So Judy Baston asks whether apple trees were common in the Middle East before the 12th century.
So I have to distinguish here between, when we mean by apple trees, we mean domesticated apples. In other words, there are crab apples, but when anything that has to do with a narrative that understands the apple as a tempting fruit to be eaten, we would have to mean something domesticated. The way we know apples. So the basic answer is no. It certainly was not. There were no apple trees in, domesticated apple trees in ancient Mesopotamia. And in fact, the Hebrew word that is the modern Hebrew word for apple, tapuach, did not mean apple in the Bible. That's a separate issue that I don't want to overburden you with, but the word tapuach in the Bible did not mean apple. No one knows exactly what it meant, but it didn't mean apple because apples simply weren't cultivated and weren't domesticated then.
Got it. And that brings us to, you talked about in the beginning about possible Jewish interpretations from the classical rabbis, wheat and grapes.
Yeah.
And I'm wondering whether there was a subsequent Jewish revisiting of the identity of the fruit, especially possibly in mystical sources?
Well, so I mean, this change did not happen in Jewish sources. I mean, in other words, it didn't originate in Jewish sources. Um, the Zohar, for example, was written in Spain, and you wouldn't expect there to be apples there, but the Hebrew word tapuach appears in a very positive way in the Zohar. In the Zohar, there's a section called Hekel Tapuchim, the Tapuach Grove, which modern Hebrew speakers understand as an apple grove, but whatever it's understood as, and it is a symbol for the Shekhinah, for the Sfira Malchut, the lowest emanation that is imminent in our world. And there's no, it's not in this particular passage that's seen as a very positive thing. Shekhinah can be seen as positive or negative in different contexts, but in this passage, it's a very positive thing. And there just doesn't develop this. The earliest place I think that might have something like this is a book called Nitzachon Wetus, Nitzachon Yashan, which is an early 13th century Jewish Christian polemic. In other words, it's written by a Jewish author, but it's written as a dialogue between a learned Jew and a Christian interlocutor. And one of the things that the Jew says to the interlocutor says, oh, you guys keep talking about God being so merciful, and yet look at what your religion teaches God did following a bite from a tapuach. That may be apple in that context, but we wouldn't be surprised by that, because in the 13th century in Germany, that's already beginning to emerge. So he may mean tapuach apple, but that would be kind of in keeping with this broader shift.
Yeah. So Tybal asks a question. This was before you sort of revealed the answer to the mystery, but I'll share the question in case the dynamic sort of evokes something for you. She asked whether it could be during an increasing time of hatred and oppression of Jews, that it was understood that the 7 species, which would have included figs, grapes, and pomegranates, that were so close associated with Judaism, that there would be a moving away from theirs to something that would not be a sort of supersessionism in effect.
I don't think so. I don't think so. First of all, we would have to situate historically what is this time of growing oppression. It seems like pretty much every time people somehow see every historical period as a period of oppression. But I don't think so, because in fact, the emergence of the forbidden fruit as an apple occurs in the 12th and 13th century, which are actually periods where a lot of Christian scholars are relying more and more on the Hebrew text and in deeper and deeper dialogue with Jewish scholars. So it's not, there's no underlying hostility. I mean, I'm not saying that these scholars aren't theologically anti-Semitic. Of course they think that Judaism needs to be overcome and so forth. But there is, at the same time, an increased cooperation between the Christian scholars in their attempt to understand the Bible and Jewish counterparts.
Great, thank you. Martin Bobrowski asks, how do you regard the apple as a symbol of women's breasts represented by the woodcut and assigning therefore evil or transgression or danger to women?
Well, I mean, so the iconography, I mean, this wasn't an art history talk, right? I was kind of looking for a very specific thing when we went through the images, but you could have a very interesting survey that focuses on the representation of Eve, and how the forbidden fruit is, or the transgression itself is understood in more or less sexual terms. So certainly, particularly in Germany, you can see a shift towards an increasing sexualization of the transgression. And part of that finds expression in very, very clear artistic analogies, visual analogies between the forbidden fruit and Eve's breasts. I'm actually teaching a course right now on the art of Genesis as commentary. So, in other words, I've collected these kind of thematic images dealing with the forbidden fruit, and now we're working on Noah and the binding of Isaac, and trying to look at the art as a kind of commentary. So that is definitely something that occurs in the 14th, 15th century, particularly in Germany. Yeah, the sexualization and the representation of the fruit as kind of analogous to Eve's breasts.
Thank you. So Olga asks about the possibility that the Bible did not specify the fruit, so no fruit would actually become evil that we would eat.
Right, right. Well, that was the last passage in Bereshit Rabbah, in the early commentary on Genesis that we saw, where the various rabbis were saying, "Oh, it's wheat or it's the citron," right? And then the last position was God didn't reveal what it was and never will reveal what it is. So, Olga, at the very least, is recreating the midrash that was already done in the 4th century, maybe, or 3rd century, and in that sense, that's possible. It remains midrashic. In other words, I don't know why God did things or why the Bible, represented things in a certain way, but that is certainly a possibility.
Great, thanks. So I'm now so that was it for the questions. I'm going to ask Rachel Beal to speak. She has something to say on behalf of New Lehrhaus. So
Yes.
Rachel.
First of all, thank you to Azzan for this brilliant lecture, and thank you, Howard and the library, for partnering with us. It's been delightful. But I also wanted to let you know that we are jumping on this bandwagon, and next Sunday, we're offering a drink and learn informal session in a beer garden in Berkeley called the Beer Baron, which will include alcoholic cider drinks on the house. For anybody that comes, there will be a little bit of teaching about more aspects of tapuach, of the Bible, of the apple. 3 o'clock on Sunday at the Beer Baron in Rockridge. And if you want to know more, to be honest, it's particularly geared at the younger population who likes to have a hard cider at 3 in the afternoon. I will drink a non-alcoholic cider. If you want more information, it'll be in our email tomorrow, and you can also email the coordinator, L-E-L-L-E, the name L, at newlehrhaus.org, and she'll give you more information. And again, thank you, Azzan, for this wonderful talk.
Thank you, Achim.
Great. Well, thank you so much, and thank you, New Lehrhaus, for presenting this, and also for suggesting it, because this was really wonderful. Azzan, is there something that you'd like to leave us with?
No, just, thank you so much. I'm sorry I am on the East Coast and won't be able to enjoy hard cider with you, those who choose to partake. And obviously, if you're interested further, you can visit the website that I alluded to earlier, treeofknowledgeart.com. And the book just came out in paperback, so it is available. And if anyone wants to explore this further, you should feel free to do so. Thank you so much.
Great, thank you. And we will send out an email message to everybody who registered tomorrow with a link to the website, to a site for purchasing the book, and with information about next Sunday's event in Rockridge. So, okay, well, be well, everybody. And for those of you who I will not see, I wish you all a good Passover. Be well.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.